Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, If You Care About Supporting Pregnant Women, You Should Care About Reproductive Justice, co-hosted by If, When, How, and the National Women's Law Center. My name is Yumhee Park, and I'm the Engagement and Mobilization Associate at the National Women's Law Center and today's moderator. We have a few technical notes before we begin the presentations. All lines will be on mute during today's webinar. We'll be taking questions after our experts are finished with the presentation, but we encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar using the webinar toolbar. We will be recording the webinar, and you'll receive a link to a recording of the presentation as well as a link to the PowerPoint slides within the next few days. At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Kelly Garcia, Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center.
Thanks, Yumhee. Thanks, Yumhee. We're excited. Sorry, my voice is a little scratchy. We are excited to have everybody here for the kickoff webinar in our If, When, How's webinar series. If you really care about webinar series, we are really excited to have everybody here, and I'm going to start off today by giving a short presentation and introduction to this webinar, to the webinar series, and then a little bit to the topic before we turn it over to Denicia Cadena from Young Women United to talk about pregnant and parenting students. But before we do that, I wanted to turn it over to Lena Houston from If, When, How. Lena?
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Houston, and I'm the Director of Campus and Community Programs at the National Office of If, When, How. This is the first webinar in our 7th annual series. We're really excited to be working together again, and I'm so glad that you've joined us today. We have 2 more webinars scheduled this fall on immigration in RJ and gun violence in RJ, so if you haven't already registered for those, please do. In case this is the first time you're tuning into the webinar series, or if you're not familiar with If, When, How, we are a national organization focused on training and mobilizing law students and legal professionals across the country to foster legal expertise and support for the realization of reproductive justice. We work with over 100 chapters on law school campuses across the country, our Rockstar Reproductive Justice Federal Fellows in Washington, D.C., State Fellows in Seattle and Pittsburgh, and HIV Fellows in Atlanta and Oakland, as well as our robust community of alums and legal professionals. You may have known us by a different name. This past summer, we went from Law Students for Reproductive Justice to If, When, How. Our new tagline, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, helps explain why. After more than a decade of supporting students to become stronger champions of reproductive justice in law school, If, When, How is expanding its focus to engage law students and legal professionals. We know that you don't stop caring about reproductive justice once you've graduated, so we wanted to be explicit about the training, networking, and advocacy opportunities we provide that will help you put your passions and skills to work for reproductive justice throughout your careers. If, When, How also changed its name to make sure our mission was heard loud and clear. We exist to fight to ensure all people can decide if, when, and how to create and sustain families with dignity, free from discrimination, coercion, and violence. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge the news of still more killings of Black folks in recent days and weeks, both the more publicized killings of Black men and the less publicized murders of Black trans women. This is absolutely a reproductive justice issue. And as reproductive justice advocates, we must work to create a world where Black lives actually matter. On behalf of If, When, How, I want to give a big thank you to the National Women's Law Center, particularly to Kelly, Yumhee, and Amanda, as well as to our esteemed presenter, Denicia, for bringing her expertise to this webinar. Thank you all so much for your interest in reproductive justice. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Lena. So I want to take a few minutes to talk very quickly about this series. So the goal of the series was really to elucidate the link between reproductive justice and other progressive issues. The idea was to introduce RJ to new communities that may only know of reproductive rights advocacy that focuses on abortion and contraception. So we really hope that this series is going to help those concerned with reproductive justice to start thinking about the social justice and human rights underpinnings of progressive work at large, and how we can all work together towards our common goals. So we have, I think, kind of mapping the progression of if, when, how. We originally started out, this webinar was really focused on law students, and over the course of the past 2 years has recognized that a lot of different people are interested. This is a great opportunity to reach out to a much broader set of people and groups. And so the series itself has now, while still very much part of the law students, is also really been designed to focus on issues that are part of a broader community and really open and welcome to other communities. So we do have 2 upcoming webinars, as Lena mentioned, if you care about immigrant rights and if you care about ending gun violence. They will be Wednesdays in October and one in November. And please do feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional thoughts on webinars that you would like to see for next year, or things that you think we should be incorporating or talking about within the existing webinars that we have already scheduled. So the reproductive justice movement is a response to the fact that women of color, low-income women, and younger women are really as likely, if not more likely, to face resistance to their childbearing and child-rearing as they are to have trouble accessing contraception and abortion. So the children of certain disadvantaged groups are often viewed as a problem to be addressed through restrictive laws and policies. So RJ recognizes that multiple forms of social oppression and discrimination keep individuals from being able to have and raise healthy families, which is really what's at the core of the reproductive justice movement. So full reproductive freedom requires addressing all forms of social inequity. So the reproductive justice lens is broader than the liberty and autonomy-based lens of traditional rights movements that we often think of. RJ recognizes that the focus on control and exploitation of women's bodies through restrictive laws and lack of protections are really a means of controlling women and communities, particularly women of color. And communities of color and women in particular are often subject both to policing of their bodies and reproductive decision-making on the one hand, and a real lack of support on the other. And the goal of reproductive justice is to ensure that women have the ability to have the children they want, raise the children they have, and plan their families through safe legal access to abortion and contraception with dignity and autonomy. So people's ability to exercise self-determination, including within their own reproductive lives, is necessarily affected by power inequalities within our society, institutions, and economic lives. So reproductive justice explicitly calls upon the government to play an affirmative role in making rights a reality and remedying social inequality, recognizing that social, political, and economic power are necessary to chart one's own future. Reproductive justice is therefore part of a larger social justice movement, and as long as there is social injustice, there will be reproductive oppression. And so that really moves us into today's topic, which is supporting pregnant women. So women should be able to make decisions about whether and when to have their families that is right for them. And once they've decided to have a family, they should be able to raise that family in a safe and healthy environment. And as you know, we don't live in an isolated world, and so we need the support of communities, schools, individuals, and our government in order to be able to achieve this. So we've faced a lot of restrictions and lack of supports in the past few years, I think. And when we think about pregnant women, we have to think about, again, the ability of women to make the decision about whether and when to have a family. And so this means that you need access to abortion, you need access to contraception, and those are both things where we've seen restrictions, particularly abortion restrictions, in the past few years. We've also seen attacks on women's autonomy and reproductive decision-making in prosecutions of pregnant women for actions that they have taken while they are pregnant. But at the same time, we've also seen some improvements in a few places, and in particular with the passage of the Affordable Care Act and expansion of Medicaid in about half of the states, we are seeing more women have insurance coverage. And with this insurance coverage, that includes coverage of preventive services with no cost sharing. Again, this means women should be able to access birth control with no cost sharing, but also things like prenatal care, preconception planning that are part of being able to decide when and whether to have children, and access to breastfeeding supports with no cost sharing as well. That's one of the preventive services that's covered. So on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of restrictions on and supports on women's reproductive autonomy, but also seeing supports for pregnant women coming up. And so today I'm going to talk kind of very briefly about two specific places where we would like to see more support and where some protections already exist. So you can see one of the places where pregnant women really deserve and need to be supported is in the workplace. And what we found is that although pregnancy discrimination is prohibited by federal law and most state laws, is explicitly prohibited by most state laws, women still can find themselves demoted or fired after for being pregnant. In addition, even when they aren't expressly demoted or fired, bosses can be very hostile to providing really basic and simple accommodations to women who need them because of a pregnancy. So, for example, we have seen women be refused the ability to take bathroom breaks when they're pregnant. In one instance I can think of where a woman was suffering from recurrent UTIs and was strongly suggested that she really needed to be able to use the bathroom more frequently, and her employer simply flat out refused to allow her to do that. Employers have also refused to allow their employees to have water. Cashiers, for example, being told they can't keep water at their stations, or not being allowed to sit on a stool. All sorts of very simple, easy accommodations that would make it possible for women to be able to have healthy pregnancies. And women really need to be able to remain in the workforce if that is what they want to do. And the burden of this lack of accommodation also often falls very explicitly and particularly on low-wage workers. So they're the precise groups of people that are least able to afford losing their jobs. And with losing your jobs, you also lose health insurance coverage or other kinds of benefits. And so no one should really be forced to be able to choose between their job or being pregnant, but that is what we sometimes are seeing out there. And so many states have started to take up what we call the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which explicitly states that employers need to provide these kinds of temporary accommodations for their pregnant workers. In addition, another place where we continue to see discrimination against pregnant and parenting students is in the education context. And so despite, again, the fact that we have a federal law, Title IX, that prohibits discrimination against pregnant students often face discrimination from their teachers, from their schools at large. Schools will refuse to allow them to continue to participate in extracurricular activities, or impose kind of really harsh punishments that aren't necessary, or kind of a strict following of the rules. So for example, pregnant students in schools that require school uniforms may find themselves being punished because they can no longer fit into the school uniform, or being punished for school absences because they needed to take time off for prenatal care, or when they're after they've had a child, need to take time off to care for their own sick children. And most of these practices are prohibited by Title IX, which does prohibit discrimination on the basis of pregnancy and requires that schools provide the same kinds of accommodations that they would provide to other kind of students who have the similar inability to attend school. However, as I said, we continue to see a lack of support for many pregnant and parenting students. And that's really a shame, I mean, in a lot of ways, as we know schools are really about educating, and their job is to educate their students. And so not only should they be following Title IX and following the law and not discriminating against students, but they should really be going out of their way and doing as much as they can to support and make sure that their students are able to stay in school. With that, I want to turn it over to Denesia.
Hi, Denesia. This is Yamhee. If you're talking, you're on mute right now, so just wanted to let you know that.
Oh, sorry about my delay, everybody, and thank you, and so excited to be with you all. My name is Denesia Cadena. I'm the Policy Director at Young Women United. Young Women United is a reproductive justice organization led by and for women of color, and we lead policy change and community organizing work in the state of New Mexico across our beautiful rural state. At Young Women United, we see our work in reproductive justice as building communities where every person has the information, education, and resources we need to make decisions about our own bodies and lives. So just briefly, I'll talk through with you all some of the other issues that we work on. I'm going to be talking tonight about a report we issued on dismantling teenage pregnancy prevention, but we see all of our work as building reproductive justice and what that looks like. So we also work to improve access to a full range of birthing options, centering midwifery models of care, and looking at how those models of care were really systematically removed from Indigenous and communities of color. We also work to decriminalize substance use in pregnancy and look at the particular issues that incarcerated women face. We work to embody a warrior state of mind to destigmatize mental health alongside LGBTQ youth of color. So knowing that many of our young people, particularly young people of color, LGBTQ people of color in our juvenile justice, foster care systems, really have underlying trauma and root causes that need to be supported with health care instead of the criminal justice system. And then that we work to improve access to reproductive health care, including abortion and contraception. One of Young Women United's other core organizing issues is that we also work to build educational equity for young parents and work to support young parents, who many others would describe as teen parents, in a whole other host of ways, but that is not what I'll be describing tonight. I will instead be talking you through, like I said, our report on dismantling teen pregnancy prevention and how teen pregnancy prevention has really allowed a lot of myths about young parents to be perpetuated in our communities. So this is the report that I'll be talking you through. It talks through a lot of myths that have been established about teen pregnancy and is available through our website, and I'm sure will be available after this webinar as well. So the first myth that I'll start us with, that it's misleading, manipulative, and profoundly unethical to scapegoat and pressure young people into the social costs rooted in systemic inequities. So I'm sure many of you, just like I have, sorry about that, have seen this image before. So this is the dollar bill that shows cost of teenage childbearing in the United States, cost our country, $9.4 billion a year. I don't think I can see your all's responses. I know you're muted, but when I'm presenting this work, I usually ask people, what do you think makes up this cost? Why is the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy and so many other advocates using these figures? And I actually had the chance to present this morning. So I asked that group. Someone told me the cost of social supports like Medicaid and food stamps. Someone else told me that it costs more to educate young parents. So this is about enhanced educational opportunities. And I always respond that I would love both of those things because it would mean that families in our communities are actually getting some of the supports that they need. But what the core of this figure is actually based on is lost tax revenue. So the National Campaign and others that create materials like this are assuming that young parents will not graduate high school and then will therefore make less money over their lifetimes and will contribute less in tax revenue. So at Young Women United, we really saw this as a troubling figure to say young people in our communities, regardless of their status as parents, we need to ensure that all of them have equal access to education, and we shouldn't be blaming young parents themselves for failures within our school systems. It's also been proven across disciplines from public health to sociology and economics that blaming young parents for being poor confuses the causality. So economic research has proven that the age you become a parent doesn't impact your economic trajectory. So if you become a parent when you are 16 and you were born in poverty, you're unlikely to rise out of poverty. If you become a parent and you're 16 and you were born into wealth, you're likely to maintain a relative level of wealth in your life, and that's unlikely to change across your lifetime. So whereas we would apply the social determinants of health as people who work in healthcare arenas and public health, many of that same information is not applied to young parents. And I'll say that this isn't just nationwide. In our report, we do critique the efforts of the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, but this is also a myth that is widely pervasive, used by reproductive rights organizations, by reproductive health organizations, and also within our state governments. Our report mentions our New Mexico Department of Legislative Finance also cited teen parents as the economic downfall of our state, whereas we know many people of all ages just need access to living wage jobs in our state. Okay, so our second myth, so the children of teen parents have poor outcomes. So this point we really took on as an organization by and for young women of color. So various scholars has described teen pregnancy as an adaptive or even protective factor. And why this is true is that particularly for Black and Native American women in our country living through the legacies of the enslavement of Black people, of colonization, of the continued police brutality against Black people and Native people, that it's actually healthier to have a baby when you are younger, particularly if you were Black or Native women, with some indications for Latina women. Why this is true, again, studies have proven that racism and the impacts of colonization physiologically impact your body. So unfortunately, it is healthier to have babies when you're younger if you're a Black or Native woman because the impacts of racism and colonization have had less time to impact your body and your mental and spiritual health. So again, that teen pregnancy can actually be a protective factor against low birth weight, against infant mortality, and can actually help those families succeed. I'll mention also here too that many of our families of color, particularly indigenous and native communities, have lived in areas of higher environmental violence. And so, again, physiologically, your body has had less exposure to nuclear waste, to uranium, to all of the toxic violence that our families have faced in communities throughout the years. So myth 3, teen parents are babies having babies. So actually 73% of teenage mothers are over the age of 18, so many of whom would be legally able to vote, to go to war for our country, to make decisions that we would otherwise consider adults. And I'll also say that our obsession around teen pregnancy and age has certainly been generational. So depending on where we live, contextually, many of our parents, of our grandparents were also teen parents, and the stigma in their generation was being unmarried or being a single parent. And within our generations, or within the past couple generations, that has shifted to a stigma around age. I'll also mention that I am the daughter of a teen parent. My father was 17 when he had my older sister, and so in many of our communities, we have been raised by strong teen parents and continue to be raised by strong teen parents. And I'll talk through here as well that there is an outright shame and stigmatizing view of teen pregnancy prevention, that teen parenting is outright horrible, that you've ruined your life, but there's also what's supposed to be a kinder version, that we simply don't want young people to have these burdens in our lives, and that at its core is not a reproductive justice tenet, that we can know better for other people's lives or that we should make decisions for other people's lives. But instead, we should assume that young families can negotiate those issues themselves. And while our society has made some strides to not encourage the coercion of people in their childbearing around race or gender or sexuality, the age is still the one area that we do feel we should control the pregnancy outcomes of other people. So finally, our final myth, so teens who have babies have ruined their lives. And so I'll just show you this image. So this is an image from the Candies Foundation. The Candies brand makes clothing, but they recruited a group of celebrities to make this anti-teen parent campaign. So here Carly Rae Jepsen, who's a singer, is telling us, you're supposed to be changing the world, not changing diapers. So I've shown this image to mothers of all ages and parents of all ages who are offended to say, obviously, one way we can change the world is to change our diapers, that there's an incredible strength in parenting, but there's also a million different ways that parents of all ages and genders are changing the world every day. But you'll see in this advertisement a tenet, or many tenets, of teen pregnancy prevention. So it's absolutely directed at the sexuality and reproduction of young women, that young women are often blamed and at the root of teen pregnancy prevention. But here, really in this myth, what the heart of that we're getting to is that once you become a teen parent, you can do nothing else with your life. And so, for us at Young Women United, why we actually got why we took this explicit stance of dismantling teen pregnancy prevention. We had for many years worked in the schools. Our youth organizers, we have a group of youth organizers, 13 to 19, had worked really hard to get comprehensive, medically accurate sex ed in the schools. And we continue to look at the model, and I've told you it's at our core to make sure everyone has the information and resources they need to make real decisions about their bodies and lives. But looking at these teen pregnancy prevention models that so many reproductive health and often almost many reproductive justice advocates use as well, put the core of that model that becoming a teen parent ruins your life. And what we know in New Mexico, and you all know nationwide, is that that model isn't working. that it wasn't proven to reduce teen pregnancy. It only served to shame and blame young parents. And so in this myth, really explaining that many young parents report feeling more motivated to finish school or to accomplish other goals in their life after they became a parent, and that having children was an incentive to become more responsible and focused than their peers. So in this, of course, saying that parenting is difficult for people of all ages. Often people face surprises no matter what you're doing because you're doing something new. But that parenting can absolutely be an incredible and motivating factor in the lives of young parents. So what does this mean for all of you? Again, it doesn't mean that you should stop promoting access to contraception. It doesn't mean that you should stop talking about comprehensive and medically accurate sex ed. It just means that you should demand that you have a different model than teen pregnancy prevention. If we really want to commit to building the futures of all young people, we first, of course, have to work side by side with them because they are the experts of their own lives and know best what is right for their lives. But if we really want to address the systemic issues that are facing them, we have to work at the underlying causes. We have to make sure young people have access to health care, have access to living wage jobs, have access to medically accurate comprehensive sex education, instead of perpetuating a misconception that teen pregnancy is a problem that must be prevented. So I am very excited to be here with all of you today. I definitely want to say at Young Women's United's idea of reproductive justice, for us, you know, as I've been speaking today about teen pregnancy prevention, is not rooted in specifically parenting, that we know that for some people that will never be the right decision, but instead is rooted in everything people need to make their own decisions about their bodies and lives. And I'm excited to hear your questions.
Thank you to our speakers today. At this time, if you have a question, please type one into the webinar toolbar and we'll make sure it gets answered. As a reminder, we're recording today's webinar and we'll send the webinar recording and slides around to everyone within the next few days. We already have a first question. What can someone who is pregnant and experiencing discrimination at school do? So Kelly, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thank you, Yamhee. So that's a nice question to kind of kick off, to kind of get started with, because I think it ties in nicely with kind of both presentations. And that's one of the things we really want to emphasize and make very clear is that people need to be supported in whatever decision they make. And when we see some of the myths that Denicia was talking about young parents, part of that, I think, comes from the fact that schools don't often provide the supports they need, that teachers can decide that once a student has become pregnant, well, that student's not going to succeed anymore. Schools used to send, and some schools still try to send pregnant students to less academic alternative schools. They don't always provide the things that are required by law, let alone to provide the kind of environment that is conducive to learning and education and feeling welcome in the schools. And so, you know, we do, as I said, those discrimination based on pregnancy against students is a violation of Title IX, and students do have recourse. So one of the things you can, of course, do is contact us at the National Women's Law Center, and we can try to help you. If we can't help you directly, at least try to connect you to the right kinds of supports. We also have a new toolkit that is specifically geared towards primarily college and graduate students, but would also be applicable and appropriate for high school students to look at as well. That's a toolkit that provides information and resources on on protecting your rights, as well as this kind of template letters, examples of ways in which you can advocate for yourself. And so definitely go to our webpage and check out that resource if you are a student and you have concerns. It was actually, the toolkit was thought of by somebody who felt like she had experienced some discrimination when she was pregnant and wanted, as a student, and wanted to make sure that that didn't happen to other students. And so it really is something that is supposed to be very user-friendly and helpful. And so please, feel free to check it out if you're a student, or if you work with students, or you're just interested in the issue that is available. But again, I just kind of want to emphasize the importance that schools are supposed to be places of education, and their goals should really be to educate their students, and they shouldn't turn their backs on or tune out to students who are pregnant or who are parents. And I think that kind of fits in well with this concern about kind of the myths around young parents.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Do any of the other panelists want to add anything?
Sure, this is Benicia. I would say that, of course, as Kelly was mentioning, there is Title IX that has protections for students, but as many of us know, our rights are often different than our lived experiences. So in our experiences working with teen parents across the state of New Mexico, that several of them were working with administrators and teachers that had no idea about Title IX policies, which is another issue to be faced, but we thought about how we could impact the lived reality of young parents. And so we worked with young parents across the state, an incredible program in the state of New Mexico, the GRADS programs, that provides in-school support for pregnant and parenting students, to pass the nation's first excused absence policy for expectant and parenting students. And what it does is, let's say a young parent has a kid who has an earache and they need to go to the doctor that day. It's an urgent issue. Young parents were telling us, we're not getting excused absences for the illnesses of our children. Teachers weren't giving makeup works, and then those students fall further and further behind. So what it does is say, you can have an excused absence for that, and also allows excused absences for the birth of a child, which seems logical to most of us, but is not being ensured for young parents across the country. And so, so what that policy means, it was written with teachers, and so, we're asked by many legislators, does this mean young parents are trying to get a free pass? So, of course not. Teachers are still want to hold young people accountable. But, however, it does allow young parents to balance their responsibilities as parents and students, just as we would allow student athletes to take time off to attend games or that sort of thing, or any sort of other activity, that we should allow young parents to balance their responsibilities as parents and students. I know the Massachusetts Alliance for Teen Pregnancy has also created a policy within the Boston School District and other attempting similar policies across the country that really impact the lived experiences of young people every day.
Great, thank you, Denicia. We have another question. I'm a volunteer for Planned Parenthood. We canvass to reduce abortion stigma. Thank you for the statistics and numbers. She would love to hear specific stories of young teens who have children and how their lives or perceptions have changed since birth.
So this is Kelly. So I don't have some great, very specific examples, but we do know from the research that young parents see having a child, will report having a child has really motivated them to stay in school. Students that had not thought about going to college now start thinking about college. The focus that young parents are, I want to say, more likely or more committed to to stay in school and again kind of go into college than similar, similar to young people of kind of similar demographics that aren't parents. And so, we see that their motivation, all of those things are out there, and that being a parent can really have a profound positive effect on their students. Denicia, did you have any kind of more specific stories?
Sure. So I'll share first that we lead our work by and for communities most impacted, and I'm not a young parent, so I'm not the best person to answer the question, but I can definitely share from our report. Every year, we also worked in New Mexico to establish a New Mexico Day in recognition of young parents, and that was a culture shift bill that we ran to really fight back against the shame and stigma that young parents face. And so in that, we have actually a couple state representatives that are young parents, and actually had a state senator that was raised by a young mom. And so all of those folks sharing that that their young parenting status really motivated them to finish school more quickly than their peers, because they had different responsibilities to balance. Every day that we celebrate, every year that we celebrate the New Mexico Day in recognition of young parents, we also have a hashtag Respect Young Fams chat. So in our report, you can see some stories that young parents themselves shared, that their kids, quote, motivated you to finish things you need to accomplish for your future because you become more determined. As one young father said, quote, as a father in my son's life, I love reading to him. It makes me happy. So you can definitely check out our report to hear little snippets of more of those quotes, and I definitely encourage you to search on Twitter or look to one of our storifies of Respect Young Fams to check out more. I'll also mention there's an incredible group called hashtag No Teen Shame that was founded by 7 young mothers that are really working to combat stigma against young mothers and young families, and they have an incredible blog in which they share some of their stories as well.
Great, thank you both. We have another question. How can I better offer support to my students who must miss the classes I teach in order to meet their pregnancy or parenting needs? I teach at an attendance-taking technical college with a strict policy for being present in the classroom.
So there are a few things that I think you can do to support your students. First, you are kind of required, and the school is required to allow pregnant students to miss classes that they need because of their pregnancy. That's part of the law, and so you can definitely encourage and work with administrators to make sure that they're following that. It's a little more complicated when it comes to the issues of missing students who for pregnant because of your parenting, because of a sick child. But again, there are ways in which I think you can, one, just advocate with the administrators and the other people at your school to have a slightly more flexible policy. And this won't just benefit parents, but it can also benefit students who might have child care responsibilities for their younger siblings, or kind of other responsibilities that can really get in the way of being able to attend school. So having a flexible policy can benefit your students across the board and can be pitched as both of these things. Another thing you can think about is ways in which you can try to be more be kind of innovative, or think outside of the box in terms of what is really needed for attendance. And so is it okay? So yes, maybe a student misses a class, and that can be challenging. I remember when I used to teach, and how hard it was when students miss class, particularly in a lab class where everybody has to participate, and if you miss that class, it was hard to make it up. But there are ways that you can kind of think ahead of time of what is it that you can do to try to make sure that students are able to make up those classes. And if that is recording your classes on on video, so that way they can watch them later if it's not the kind of thing that absolutely requires participation, or scheduling, which I know is a big burden on teachers and professors to be able to schedule classes, makeup classes, so that way you can try to ameliorate the fact that classes are, that somebody has to miss class. But I know it can really be a challenge, but I think if we can, when just generally speak with administrators and advocate for your students at that level, as well as think about ways in which you students are able to both meet those attendance requirements as well as get the benefit of the classes while at the same time being able to be flexible for the fact that students are going to have to miss sometimes. Benicia, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I think what you shared is great, Kelly, and thank you so much for the question. I would say definitely that it's been our experience working with educators that even one educator can make the difference for a school policy. It's always my advice, if you feel like you do have any momentum with the administration, to create as explicit of a policy as possible. It's just something that I'm sure was explicitly created, but there may be, as Kelly was describing, different ways to encourage that same participation. So if you're willing to be an advocate and speak to the administration, or to get an echo chamber within your colleagues, that writing a specific policy can have a lot of impact on the lived experiences of your students. And even if it's not the best of the world, so even in our New Mexico policy, we have 10 days for the documented birth of a child, and in one of our school districts, we actually have 6 weeks of homebound instruction, and obviously that's much preferred, but we realize that that's not going to be realistic for all of our schools right now. So seeing what you can realistically work with and being willing to take that as a starting point.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Can Title IX work to support teens or young parents who are working to continue breastfeeding upon returning to middle or high school?
So Title IX, yes, we at the National Women's Law Center would say that yes, that Title IX protection should extend to allowing students to take reasonable breaks to pump or breastfeed when they're at school. And as you may know, as part of the Affordable Care Act, employees who are not exempt, so primarily kind of hourly employees, are entitled to reasonable breaks to express breast milk or to breastfeed when they're at work. And we think that that principle, that anti-discrimination principle that is now part of the law, extends to Title IX, and so students also need to have those accommodations.
Yes, this is Benicia. As Kelly mentioned, Title IX should extend to breastfeeding. That doesn't necessarily mean it is, and some of our partners have been taking explicit stance to make sure that it does. So our partners at California Latinas for Reproductive Justice and others in California did just pass an explicit policy around breastfeeding in students. Like I already mentioned, our incredible New Mexico grads program here does have pilot sites within the schools that they're building, not just reasonable accommodations for young women, which might mean, a tiny room somewhere where there's no color and fluorescent lights, but really building out spaces where young people are encouraged to breastfeed. I will also say that it is very important in Young Women's United stance to make sure that breastfeeding that accommodations are offered and that breastfeeding is accepted as normal, but to also understand students that may have lived through trauma or their bodies are not able to produce milk, or they have emotional or mental health issues that may not make breastfeeding the best option for them. Breast is not always best. That we also have accommodations for those students that they may want to pump, not directly feed their children themselves, that they may want to take out time to formula feed, and that we should make sure we have accommodations for all of those things.
Great. And Denise, I think we have another question for you. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the history of how attitudes shifted regarding stigmatizing single parents to young people. When did the shift start taking place, and were there ways in which it started manifesting?
Sure, absolutely. So I mentioned there's certainly probably a difference to this regionally. I was raised by a young father. My grandparents were young parents, as probably what my great-grandparents were as well. But the national adolescent birth rate in 1957 was nearly 4 times what it is today. And again, like today, the majority of those young people were 18 and 19. And the real social context was in this time. And I'm sure many of us can think of this generationally, if we were raised in that generation or if our parents were, was within the context of being married. So as long as you were married, it didn't really matter the age you had children because you were following your normal life course and life path. So you were building that nuclear family in which the child had 2 parents and you were raising children. So I think, the shift started to happen, again, just gaining traction along those years, but now the real stigma being focused on age. So, what we hear in the teen pregnancy prevention campaigns is, if you just wait, you can build a better economic future for yourselves. Or, again, thinking about the Candies campaign, they have these ads that show a baby in a crib, and it says, not what you would picture as your first crib, right? And so it's important for us to acknowledge that all of those things are myths. For young people who are born into poverty and might not have economic opportunities in their communities, whether or not they have children, whether or not they make different decisions in their lives, unfortunately, their economic future may not be impacted. And so that really is a real problem, and that's something we need to obviously look at the root causes of why often people of color are not provided economic opportunity, why people are born into poverty, why people who are disabled, and look at those real root causes.
Great, thank you. We have time for a couple more questions, and we have one more. What advice would you give young parents entering or in the workforce about knowing their rights or protections?
This is Kelly. So I think I think it's important for that everybody knows of kind of the general protections that they have in the workplace. And so a lot of people, don't necessarily know that they're, again, protected from things like pregnancy discrimination, but also that you might have, in some states have protection if you've got your scheduling is you're giving constantly shifting schedules, or your schedule's at the last minute, or your employer cancels on you at the last minute, which can often really be be very challenging, particularly for younger workforce, for women in kind of retail jobs in particular, and that your state might have protections for you to make sure that your schedule is in the right place. And you also have there's also kind of the general concerns about marrying for a lot of young parents, that you have to do both school, both stay in school, finish your education at the same time while trying to hold down a job, and that can also be very challenging. And again, kind of speaking back to what Denise said about kind of the way people's lived experiences are, and that a lot of times that there might be some space there to speak with, to get supports from administrators or teachers or employers to be able to give the kind of flexibility that is going to be needed in order to both care for a child while attending school and trying to hold down a job. Now, I can say kind of, if you go, our website at the National Women's Law Center does have kind of a set of resources and information on workplace protections, and that's another place where you can find some materials, and we have some additional toolkits. But yeah, I mean, part of what people, I think, need to do is when something happens at work or in school even, but when something happens that you kind of think, hey, that's not right, that doesn't seem like that should be happening, to go ahead and listen to that inner voice, listen to yourself and say, hey, maybe that's not right, maybe that's not allowed, and then try to check that out. And again, the National Women's Law Center is one place where you can go to resources, but a lot of times there are state and local organizations that can help you figure out if an employer or if your school even is violating the law, or if there are ways that you can start advocating for yourself and taking some action, or if there are some people out there that can help you advocate for yourself.
Great, thank you, Kelly. I think those are all the questions that we have time for today. Please feel free to email us any questions we didn't answer, or if you have any more questions, and we'll make sure to send you a response within a few days. And now I'll turn the floor back over to Kelly to close.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Yemhi and Amanda, for helping get this webinar together. And thank you so much, Denicia, for presenting. This was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. It was really terrific, and I appreciate you taking your time. And Lena, thank you as well for joining us. And again, our next webinar is going to be in October, will be on immigrant rights. So please keep an eye out for that, and we hope you can join us again. Thank you all.